If you grew up in a town where the factory whistle marked the beginning of the day, you remember the sound. Six in the morning. The street slowly waking up. Men in steel-toe boots walking toward the plant, lunchboxes in their hands. For decades, places like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland were not just cities. They were the engines of America.
Port steady now! Steady she goes. Steady, boys blind, holding strong.
Steel, cars, glass, machines. The things that built the modern world. And for millions of families, those factories meant something simple. A paycheck, a house, a future. But then something happened.
I can't believe it's over. What do we do now? Don't know. Just don't.
The whistle stopped. The gates closed, and entire cities began to change. Factories that once employed tens of thousands became silent, empty, almost forgotten. So what happened? How did the most powerful industrial machine in human history begin to disappear? And the bigger question many Americans still ask today, was this the end of an era, or just the beginning of something new? Tonight, we investigate the rise and then the fall of American industry. Before the smokestacks, before the furnaces and the hammers and the roar of iron on iron, before the factory whistle that told a man when to wake up and when to go home, there was just the land. America in 1790 was a nation of farmers, traders, and craftsmen. A young country still trying to understand what it was capable of. The rivers ran clear.
A fine sight, but will it hold? The current is strong enough. Aye, but mind the wear.
The forests were enormous, and the idea that this continent would one day become the greatest industrial power in human history would have seemed, to most people living then, completely impossible. But in the small towns of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, something was already beginning. The rivers of New England fell fast and hard off the hills. And where water fell, it could be captured. Where it could be captured, it could be made to work. The first American factories weren't built by great industrialists with enormous fortunes. They were built next to waterfalls, modest, practical, ingenious, using the force of nature to turn spindles and drive looms. In 1790, a young English immigrant named Samuel Slater arrived in Rhode Island carrying something more valuable than money. He carried entirely from memory the technical knowledge of British textile machinery. Back in England, sharing that knowledge was illegal. The British Empire knew what its machines were worth. Slater had memorized the blueprints anyway. In Pawtucket, Rhode Island, he built the first successful water-powered cotton spinning mill in the United States, a modest building by any measure, but a beginning. What followed became known as the Rhode Island system. Small factory villages, scattered along rivers, each one a little world of its own. Families came to work. Children worked alongside adults. The factory owner controlled not just the mill, but often the housing, the store, the church. It was a new kind of life. Harder in some ways than farming. More structured. More dependent on someone else's clock. And then, in Massachusetts, a merchant named Francis Cabot Lowell traveled to England. He toured the textile factories there. As a tourist, they thought. He was memorizing everything he saw. Back in America, Lowell built something more ambitious. A fully integrated textile system, spinning and weaving under one roof, powered by the Merrimack River. The city that grew around his mills would bear his name. Lowell, Massachusetts became a model, a planned city built entirely around industrial production. The workers who filled its mills were young women, daughters of New England farms, drawn by wages higher than domestic service and the promise of something new. They lived in company boarding houses. They worked by the bell. They organized the first labor protests in American history. The machine had woken up, and America would never be the same. For the first half of the 19th century, American industry grew the way a river grows, slowly at first, then all at once. The canals came first. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the Atlantic coast. For the first time, goods could move from the interior of the continent to the ports of New York without crossing mountains on foot. Cities along the canal route, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, grew almost overnight. Buffalo became a gateway, a place where the raw material of the American interior met the markets of the world. Then came the railroads, and the railroads changed everything. By the 1840s and 1850s, iron rails were spreading across the country like veins. What had taken weeks by wagon now took days by train. The distance between markets collapsed. A factory in Philadelphia could sell to a customer in Ohio. A mine in Pennsylvania could send coal to a furnace in New York. The country was knitting itself together, and the thread was iron, and iron required coal, and coal required more iron. To move coal, you needed railroads, but to build railroads, you needed steel, and to make steel, you needed coal. It was a circular process, each industry feeding the next, each city growing because the one beside it was growing too. Deep under the mountains of western Pennsylvania, the coal was almost beyond counting. And not far away in the hills of the Ohio Valley, iron ore lay waiting. When those two things met, coal and iron ore, in the right furnace, at the right temperature, they became steel. Strong, flexible, permanent steel. The material from which the modern world would be built. The cities of the Northeast and Midwest began to feel the pull of this. Pittsburgh sat at the confluence of three rivers, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio. No location in the country was better suited for what was coming. Cleveland sat on Lake Erie, a perfect port. Youngstown was close to both coal and ore. The geography itself seemed to be pointing toward something. Then the Civil War came, and war, as it always does, accelerated everything. The Union needed guns, rails, cannons, ships, uniforms, boots, wagons. It needed industry, and the industry of the North delivered. Factories that had made civilian goods switched to war production overnight. The capacity built in peacetime was now tested in a way no one had imagined. When the war ended in 1865, America emerged changed. The country had proven it could produce at a scale few had believed possible. The factories were there. The workers were there. The railroads were there. And an enormous nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific was waiting to be supplied. The great industrial era was about to begin. If you want to understand what happened in America between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century, you have to understand one man, one immigrant, one ambition so vast it seems almost fictional. Andrew Carnegie arrived in America from Scotland as a child with nothing. He worked as a bobbin boy in a cotton factory, then as a telegraph operator, then as a railroad manager. He saved, he invested, he watched, and somewhere along the way, he understood something that most people hadn't yet grasped. That steel was going to build the modern world, and that the man who controlled steel would control an enormous share of the future. Carnegie built his empire in Pittsburgh. Not just a factory, an entire vertically integrated system. He owned the iron ore mines in Minnesota. He owned the ships that carried ore across the Great Lakes. He owned the coke and coal operations in Pennsylvania. He owned the railroads that connected it all. And at the center of it, he owned the furnaces in Braddock and Homestead, enormous, blazing, unstoppable, producing more steel than entire European nations. The smoke over Pittsburgh was so thick it sometimes blocked the sun by noon. But this was also a story with a darker edge. The men who worked those furnaces worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. They were paid barely enough to live on. When they tried to organize to ask for something better, Carnegie's partner Henry Clay Frick sent armed men to stop them. In 1892, at the Homestead Steel Works, that confrontation became a battle. Workers and Pinkerton agents fought on the banks of the Monongahela River. Men died. The Union was broken. The great industrialists were not just building an economy, they were also building a power structure, one that would define the relationship between capital and labor in America for generations. And yet, something else was also happening in these years. Something harder to see, but just as important. Millions of people were coming. From Ireland, from Italy, from Poland, from Hungary, from Slovakia, from Russia, from the American South. They came because they had heard the same rumor in a dozen different languages, that in America, there was work, in real factories that paid real wages. They arrived with almost nothing. They settled near the mills and the furnaces. They built churches and neighborhoods and social clubs organized by the countries they had left behind. They worked the hardest jobs in the most dangerous conditions. They learned English from their children. They saved money. They bought houses on small lots in the shadow of the smokestacks. They became, in time, the backbone of the American working class. By 1900, the United States had become the largest industrial economy in the world, surpassing Britain, the country that had invented the Industrial Revolution. The transformation had taken barely 50 years. The great American machine was now running at full speed, and no one, not yet, was thinking about what might slow it down. In 1913, inside a factory on the edge of Detroit, Henry Ford's engineers perfected something that would change the nature of work forever. The moving assembly line. Before this moment, a car was built by a team of workers who moved around a stationary vehicle, each man doing multiple jobs, the whole process slow and skilled and expensive. Ford's idea was the opposite. The car moved on a continuously moving belt, and each worker stood in one place and did one thing, the same motion, the same bolt, hundreds of times per shift. It was efficient beyond anything the world had seen. The time it took to build a Model T dropped from over 12 hours to less than 2. The price of the car fell so far that, for the first time, ordinary working people could afford to buy one. The automobile was no longer a luxury. It was becoming a necessity. But the assembly line had a cost. The work was numbing, repetitive, soul-flattening. Workers quit at an alarming rate. The turnover in Ford's plants was extraordinary, because no one wanted to stand in one place doing the same movement, hour after hour, day after day. Ford's response was famous. In January 1914, he announced a new wage, $5 a day for an 8-hour shift, nearly double what most factory workers earned. The news spread like wildfire. The next morning, 10,000 men showed up outside the Highland Park plant looking for work, but there was a condition. To earn the $5 wage, a worker had to be investigated. Ford's sociological department sent inspectors to workers' homes to check that they were living properly, not drinking, not gambling, speaking English, keeping a clean house. It was paternalistic. It was invasive. It was, in Ford's mind, part of the bargain. And yet, for the men who qualified, it was genuinely transformative. $5 a day meant a man could rent a decent house, buy furniture, afford food beyond the bare minimum, save money. The factory worker, for the first time, could imagine a life that looked something like middle class. Then, in 1914, the world went to war. America did not enter the First World War until 1917, but American factories were supplying the Allies almost immediately. Steel, ammunition, vehicles, uniforms, the industrial capacity of the North and Midwest poured into the war effort. The factories ran around the clock, and something else happened. With European immigration cut off by the war, and with millions of young men entering the military, factories were suddenly desperate for labor. They turned to a source they had largely ignored: Black Americans in the rural South, who had been living under Jim Crow laws in conditions little better than the poverty their grandparents had endured after emancipation. The Great Migration had begun. Hundreds of thousands of black families left the South, left sharecropping and segregation and violence, and headed north, to Chicago, to Detroit, to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to the factory cities, where the wages were real and the laws, while still deeply unfair, offered at least the possibility of something different. They came with hope. They arrived to find that the North had its own forms of discrimination, its own red lines drawn on housing maps, its own limits. But they came anyway. And they worked, And they built lives. And the cities of the industrial North were never the same. There is a word that doesn't get used often enough when we talk about American industry. That word is scale. What American factories achieved during the Second World War was not just impressive. It was, by any historical measure, staggering. It may be the single greatest feat of industrial production in human history. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America's military was small. Its factories were producing consumer goods: cars, refrigerators, washing machines. Within months, those same factories were producing tanks, bombers, warships, artillery shells by the millions. President Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy. It wasn't just a speech. It was a description of what the country was about to become. Ford's enormous River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, a complex so large it had its own railroad system and steel mill, was converted to produce B-24 bombers. At its peak, it completed a finished bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit was built from scratch and began delivering tanks within a year. Shipyards in cities from Baltimore to Seattle launched vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. By the end of the war, America had produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, and 8,800 naval vessels. Numbers that, written down, still seem barely believable. And behind every one of those numbers was a worker. Women entered the factories in enormous numbers for the first time. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was millions of real women who learned to weld and rivet and operate machinery while their husbands and brothers were overseas. Many would never fully leave the workforce. Black workers took on roles that had been closed to them before, though often still at lower wages and in segregated facilities. The contradiction was painful and visible. Black men fighting for a democracy abroad that denied them full citizenship at home. Black workers building the arsenal of freedom in factories that still treated them as second class. The war ended. The soldiers came home. The factories, vast, modern, optimized, were still standing. And here is where the American story enters its most complicated chapter. Because for a brief, extraordinary moment, everything seemed to work. The factories kept running. The workers kept working. The cities kept growing. For a generation of Americans who had survived the Depression and the war, that moment felt like more than prosperity. It felt like proof of something. It felt like America had finally become what it was always supposed to be. They were right. They were also, without knowing it, approaching a peak from which the only direction was down. If you grew up in a factory city in the 1950s or 1960s, if you grew up in Pittsburgh or Detroit or Cleveland or Buffalo or Youngstown, you probably remember what it felt like when everything was working. The whistle at the start of a shift, the lunch pails, the men in work clothes walking the same streets their fathers had walked, heading to the same plants, doing work they knew and understood and had pride in, the paycheck that came every 2 weeks and covered the mortgage and the groceries and still left something for the weekend. The United States in 1945 emerged from the war with something no other major industrial nation had: its factories intact. Europe and Japan lay in rubble. Their industrial capacity had been bombed into ruin. America's had not. For the next 2 decades, the United States produced nearly half of the entire world's manufactured goods. Think about that for a moment. Half the world's output, coming from one country. The benefits flowed downward, not equally, not fairly, but more broadly than at almost any other moment in American history. Union membership reached its peak. The United Auto Workers negotiated contracts that gave factory workers health insurance, pensions, paid vacations. A man on the assembly line in Detroit could buy a house in the suburbs, a car, sometimes 2, and send his kids to college. This was the industrial American dream. Not the dream of the entrepreneur or the investor. The dream of the man who worked with his hands and was rewarded for it. The dream of a family that didn't have to worry about next month's rent. Cities prospered. Downtown Pittsburgh gleamed with department stores and theaters and restaurants packed on a Saturday night. Cleveland's industrial neighborhoods were full of life. Youngstown, a city built almost entirely around steel, was one of the highest income cities per capita in the entire United States. In 1950, it was booming. But something was shifting, quietly, in the background. Something that most people working the day shift couldn't see. Manufacturing as a share of the American economy had actually peaked in 1953. West Germany was rebuilding. Japan was modernizing with American help, adopting production methods that in some ways were more efficient than the ones Americans had invented. The steel that once only America could produce was now being made more cheaply across the ocean. The warning signs were there. The economic historians could see them. But for most families living the golden age, cashing the union check, driving the new car, watching the kids play in the backyard of the house they owned, there was no reason to think it would end. It always feels permanent, until it isn't. The decline of American industry did not arrive like a flood. It came like a slow leak, year by year, plant by plant, neighborhood by neighborhood, until one day people looked around and realized the water had risen to their necks. The early signs came in the 1970s. The oil crises of 1973 and 1979 sent energy costs through the roof. American steel, already more expensive than German and Japanese steel, became even harder to compete with. Small plants closed first, the older ones the least efficient. Nobody made a big announcement. The sign on the gate just changed, and then the gate stayed locked. Then came the automation. The machines that replaced human hands didn't hate anyone. They didn't have anything against the workers they displaced. They were simply more efficient. A single machine could do the work of a dozen men. The factories that stayed open needed fewer and fewer people to run them. And then there was globalization. Trade agreements opened American markets to goods made in countries where a factory worker earned in a week what an American worker earned in an hour. The economics were brutal and simple. Companies moved production south, then overseas. The jobs followed the lower costs. Between 1969 and 1996, manufacturing employment in the Rust Belt fell by roughly 1/3. Not one factory. 1/3 of all factory jobs in the entire industrial heartland. Gone. But the numbers don't tell the human story. To understand what that meant, you have to understand what those jobs were. A factory job in those years wasn't just a paycheck, it was a community. It was your brother-in-law working the line beside you. It was the union hall where people gathered after the shift. It was the identity of an entire neighborhood. When the plant closed, it wasn't just employment that disappeared. It was a way of life. By the early 1980s, under President Reagan, the economy had shifted decisively toward finance and services. The prevailing argument was that manufacturing was the past, that the future belonged to information and technology, that America didn't need to make things. It needed to think of things and let other countries make them. For the men and women who had spent their lives building things with their hands, that argument was hard to hear. It still is. Between 1979 and 1982 alone, something like 40% of America's steelworkers were laid off. On some days, 10,000 workers lost their jobs at once. A single announcement, a single press release, changing 10,000 lives instantly and completely. The rust was spreading, the belt was breaking, and whole cities were about to find out what happens when the one thing that built you disappears. September 19, 1977, Youngstown, Ohio. The workers at Youngstown Sheet and Tube showed up for their shift the way they always did. They had been doing it for years, some of them for decades. The mill was the center of everything in Youngstown. It was where their fathers had worked, where their neighbors worked, where their whole community was anchored. That morning, the announcement came. The mill was closing. 5,000 jobs gone immediately. The company had decided it was no longer worth it. In Youngstown, that day became known as Black Monday. And it was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Youngstown lost 40,000 manufacturing jobs. It lost 400 businesses. It lost more than $400 million in personal income. It lost 75% of its school tax revenue in some neighborhoods. And it lost people, hundreds of thousands of them, who packed up and left because there was nothing left to stay for. Since Black Monday, Youngstown has lost nearly 60% of its population. A city that was once a model of American industrial prosperity is now one of the most economically distressed places in the United States. Youngstown's story is not unique. It is the story of an era. If you grew up in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, or Buffalo, this story might feel very familiar. Maybe it's your story. Maybe it's your parents' story. Maybe you remember when the plant closed and the neighborhood changed and some of the families on your block started disappearing, moving away. Not sure where, just away. Detroit tells perhaps the most dramatic version of this story. At its peak, Detroit was a city of nearly 1.85 million people, the fourth largest city in America. By 2020, fewer than 640,000 remained. More than two-thirds of its people had left. The city declared bankruptcy in 2013. At one point, there were approximately 76,000 abandoned buildings in and around Detroit. Empty houses, shuttered stores, silent factories slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather. Cleveland and Pittsburgh each lost close to half their populations between 1950 and 2010. Buffalo shrank. Gary, Indiana, once a proud steel city, nearly emptied out entirely. What happened to the people who stayed? Many of them are still there, still in the houses they or their parents bought when the mills were running, watching the neighborhood change around them, watching the tax base disappear, watching the schools deteriorate, the buses stop running, the clinics close. Poverty rates in these cities soared. Detroit's poverty rate went from 14.9% in 1970 to over 33% by the early 2020s. In Youngstown, concentrated poverty became so severe it led national rankings. In Flint, Michigan, where GM employment collapsed from 80,000 workers to barely 7,000, the city's infrastructure fell apart so completely that the water became poisonous. These were not natural disasters. They were economic ones. And the communities left behind did not choose to be abandoned. They told us the service economy was the future, and in many places it is. The American economy today is, by most measures, enormous, larger than it has ever been. Technology companies worth more than entire countries. Financial institutions managing wealth on a scale no previous generation could have imagined. A service sector employing hundreds of millions of people in hospitals, hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and call centers. But there is a difference between a service economy and an industrial economy that goes beyond the numbers. And the people who lived through the transition feel it, even if they can't always put it into words. A factory job, in the era of strong unions and strong industry, was a specific kind of thing. It was a job you could do without a college degree and still make a middle-class income. It came with health insurance. It came with a pension. It came with the expectation that if you showed up and worked hard, you would be okay. Not rich. Okay. Secure. The service economy replaced that with something different, often lower wages, rarely benefits, almost never a pension. The new jobs were real. There were millions of them. But they didn't provide the same foundation. A man who once made $25 an hour with benefits at a steel mill found himself, after the mill closed, making $10 an hour at a big-box retail store that could let him go at any time for any reason. That gap, between what was lost and what replaced it, is where the anger lives, where the despair lives, and increasingly where the politics of the last 20 years have been shaped. Some cities found a way through. Pittsburgh is the most often cited example, a city that rebuilt itself around healthcare, education, and technology after the steel industry collapsed. The University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon became engines of a new economy. The city became a hub for robotics and biotech. It was genuinely remarkable. But even Pittsburgh's revival is complicated. The neighborhoods that rebuilt are not always the neighborhoods that suffered most. The people who benefit from the tech economy are not always the children of the steelworkers. And the broader region of western Pennsylvania, the smaller towns, the old mill communities just outside the city, has not shared in the recovery. Drive 30 minutes outside Pittsburgh and you enter a different world entirely. Across the wider Rust Belt, nostalgia has mixed with resentment to produce a political realignment that shaped national elections. The men and women of the old industrial heartland didn't just lose jobs. They lost identity. They lost the story they told about themselves, about work and dignity, and earning your place in America through the labor of your hands. Nobody replaced that story with something better. There are new factories going up in America. In Columbus, Ohio, a semiconductor plant worth $20 billion is under construction, one of the largest manufacturing investments in American history, made possible by the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. In South Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee, foreign automakers have built modern assembly plants. In Texas and Arizona, the technology economy has generated a new kind of industrial landscape. America is trying to make things again. The word for it now is reshoring, bringing production back from overseas. The argument for it is partly economic and partly strategic. A country that doesn't make its own computer chips, its own medicines, its own steel, is vulnerable in ways that became painfully clear during the pandemic. So is American industry coming back? The honest answer is, something is. But it is not the same thing that was lost. The new semiconductor plant in Ohio will employ thousands of workers. But it will employ them differently than the steel mills employed their workers in 1960. The new factory floor runs on automation, on precision engineering, on a workforce that needs technical education and computer skills. It is real work, important work. But it is not work that a man can walk into with a high school diploma and a strong back and a willingness to learn on the job. The industrial economy that built the middle class, the economy that turned immigrant families and great migration families and farm families into homeowners, that built the union halls and the bowling leagues and the Catholic parishes and the Little League fields of the American Rust Belt. That economy is not coming back. Not in the form it had. The conditions that created it, the post-war dominance, the lack of global competition, the strength of organized labor, the particular geography of coal and iron and water, those conditions cannot be recreated. What can be done, what is being done, is different. A new industrial America, leaner, more automated, more technically sophisticated, capable of producing extraordinary things, but employing fewer people per square foot of factory space than at any point in history. And so the question that this documentary has been building toward is not really an economic question. It is a human one. What happens to a nation when the work that defined it disappears? What happens to the cities built around that work? To the families who organize their lives around it? To the men and women who find that the skills they spent decades developing are no longer needed, that the economy has moved on without them or around them or past them? What happens to the pride, the identity, the story a community tells about itself? If you grew up in a town where the factory whistle marked the start of the day, where your father walked out the door at 5:45 in the morning in work boots and came home at 4 in the afternoon smelling of metal, you probably understand what it meant when that whistle stopped. It wasn't just a sound that went quiet. It was a way of life, a set of values, a promise that America had made to its working people, and that somewhere along the way, America quietly stopped keeping. The new factories are real. The investments are real. The future being built in semiconductor plants and battery facilities and advanced manufacturing centers across the country is real. But the past is real too, and so are the people it left behind. The question that America still hasn't fully answered, the question hanging over every political debate, every economic plan, every election, is this: what do we owe the places and the people that built us? And until we answer that honestly, the rust will keep spreading, not in the factories, in the spaces between us. If this story felt familiar, if you recognized a city, a family, or a memory, leave it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and share this with someone who lived it. Because some histories deserve to be remembered.